My fourth and last point on how we move the global development agenda forward is around the importance of strong and innovative partnerships, because development as a process isn't enabled by any single actor. There are so many actors. If I start with the international actors, of course development cooperation these days is highly multifaceted, incorporating not only the north-south flows of official development assistance, but also south-south cooperation and the role of the mega philanthropic initiatives, vigorous civil society involvement, the role of the private sector too. The south-south flows of finance, technology and know-how are now very substantial. Developing countries have many lessons learned that they want to share and many useful technologies to assist others to meet their development challenges. As China gears up to be a major producer of low-cost, low-carbon technologies, I think that's going to be enormously helpful with mitigation activity going forward in much of the South. In our own organisation, we see facilitating South-South exchange of experience and knowledge as absolutely central to the work that we do. We are establishing more strategic relationships with those who are active on South-South cooperation. The relationships will take a number of forms, including supporting countries which request our assistance to establish and sustain their own development cooperation programs. And we are getting approaches now from quite a number of emerging contributors to South-South cooperation around that. The private sector's contribution, well, this is critical. You know, the MDGs specify a set of development outcomes we would all love to see. Perhaps it reflects my Asia-Pacific background, but when I look at what has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in China, I look at the development of a strong economy. I look at the role of investment. I look at the role of trade. These are critical ingredients of development. The trick, of course, from a human development perspective, is to ensure that economic growth is also green and inclusive. But to think we can do it without growth, I don't think is sensible. So the private sector certainly has a significant role to play. At UNDP, we've developed what is called a Growing Inclusive Markets Initiative, which goes beyond the traditional thinking about global corporate social responsibility. It's about promoting business models in which the pursuit of wealth creation for a business are seen as entirely compatible with human progress and development and environmental sustainability. Your own country, Australia, along with Britain and our organisation, have been spearheading what's called a business call to action, designed to enlist the private sector as an active partner in achieving the MDGs. And Kevin Rudd personally has been very supportive of this work. Strong partnerships, of course, are also needed within the UN development system itself. I referred to the 27 agencies in the UN Development Group. Of course, if you started with a blank piece of paper at the start of the 21st century and said, would you have 27 agencies? The answer would undoubtedly be no. But we have to work with reality. We have agencies with a long and proud history. In the case of the ILO, going back to 1919 and the birth of the League of Nations, the job for us is to coordinate very, very closely in what we do for the benefit of developing countries. I would, of course, also want to underline that in development, the vast bulk of the resources come from developing countries themselves. What we can do through development cooperation must therefore aim to be catalytic and supportive. It can't do the whole job, and nor can it substitute for committed leaders and vision and solid strategies and policies and a capacity to deliver in country. That is absolutely basic if we're to make progress. But I'm a strong believer that if we have the resources, if we have the strong partnerships, if we can back the leaders, governments and people with a vision of what can be, we can make a substantial difference for development. And I certainly hope to be supporting that process in my present capacity. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for a fascinating discussion. It's both daunting and inspiring, I think we'd say. Ms. Clark's agreed to take some questions from the audience. Can you please, if you'd like to ask a question, raise your hand, and one of our staff will bring a microphone to you.
Your comments on women's health interested me, and I was just wondering if you could comment on the opportunities in the next few years as a result of caveats being removed from Australian aid and US aid around birth control and abortion programs and so forth.
Well, it's just been incredibly helpful for the US to come back as a funder of the UN Population Fund, which does incredible work to try to expand choices for women, family spacing, and so on. So, changes which are supportive of work of agencies like that are just so critical. I mean, so many women in the developing world just don't have access to basic primary health services, to a skilled birth attendant. And sadly, the human face of this problem may well be a girl in her very young teens giving birth with no support at all, with no access to proper hygiene, no access to help if there's difficulties with the birth, and maternal mortality so often relates to very, very young women in those circumstances. So, yeah, it's just tremendous that more countries are coming on board to try and be supportive of this agenda.
Thanks. Fiona Wayne, Environment Business Australia. Thank you. I wanted to ask you some questions about the 1 billion people with suffering from chronic hunger at the moment, and the sheer scale of desertification and soil erosion that we have going on. And yet we know from the work that the FAO has been doing and our own work in Environment Business Australia and biosequestration, that we can replenish soil, carbon, minerals and nutrients. So instead of a large focus being on geological sequestration of CO2, look to biosequestration of CO2 so that we enhance those soils and can, on a long-term basis, but starting with action immediately, start to rebuild those soils, because water is a huge problem, but soil is huge as well.
Mm. And I think this is an area where Australia's got an incredible contribution to make, because you face this problem just as a country in the Sahel does, just as a country in East Africa does. You're facing that desertification and prolonged and protracted drought. So, I think Australia, working in solidarity with affected countries, you can do a power of good, and you have the science, the insights, the knowledge to back it up. And I just think it could be a very significant part of what Australia sets out to do on development.
Yeah, one of the themes that seemed to be running through your presentation, Helen, was the need for resourcing, whether it's climate change, MDGs, the whole issue of partnership. And just noting the renewed interest in a tax on financial transactions at a global level, including securities and derivatives, and seeing that Messrs Sarkozy, Brown are supporting that initiative. I'd just be interested in your thoughts on how that agenda might be driven forward. It has failed in the past.
Yeah. Well, there's an old saying, money isn't everything, but it sure helps. and that is true of development. As I said, what we do by way of official development assistance is only ever, the small part of development spending, but it can be catalytic and extremely useful. So you're right to raise the issue of, are there innovative financing sources that might be possible? And when leaders of the stature of Gordon Brown and President Sarkozy start talking about Tobin taxes in effect, maybe they have the power to move mountains. in the background of the, distrust, I suppose, around the climate negotiations, is the concern of developing countries that funding for adaptation and mitigation be both extra on top of ODA and be predictable. And behind this atmosphere of distrust is that the grand pledges don't materialise. I commend Australia for sort of keeping its word on its pledges, but what is always in our face is the G8 in Glen Eagles. 2005, grand pronouncement that aid levels would be doubled from 2004 to 2010, and specifically be doubled for Africa. Now, depending on what baseline for CPI or movement costs you use, we would estimate that the commitment to Africa is 80 to 90% under-delivered. So then we expect people to sign up to climate agreements when there's got to be money, and it's got to be predictable, and it's got to be extra. Whether it's extra to the 0.7 or extra to what people pay now is another issue. But something like these Tobin taxes could have a role to play in that if it's adequate and predictable. But the problem is to get global action. It's one thing for one country to legislate for these things. How do you get it country by country by country? But I think there's been a lot of creative thinking given to alternatives, and we should support those leaders who are out there, pushing the envelope on what could be done.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation. My name is Ian Anderson from the Asian Development Bank. My question is about equity. It's pretty clear that a number of the countries in the region, especially from Asia, will actually reach the MDG goals at a national level, or at least at a national average level, but that the poorest 20%, and particularly in terms like child mortality, infant mortality, and especially maternal mortality, the bottom 20% will be virtually untouched. And I wonder if when we look at what happens to the MDG goals after 2015, we could think about putting an equity criteria in there.
Yeah. Well, of course, you're absolutely right. And some of the work which UNDP does in a wide range of countries where we're asked to help report on the MDGs is we focus in on the inequalities between regions, between ethnic groups, maybe faith communities, so that countries can be helped to define where the disparities are and how to address them. For example, we've been asked to help with China's next generation poverty strategy, because while China has achieved at the national level, it has significant inequality still within country, which it's conscious of. But there are many countries who are asking for that sort of support. You raised the issue though of should this be a bigger focus post 2015, and we've yet to see how the debate will unfold about what happens post 2015. I think it would be an awful shame to let the idea of development goals like this with a clear focus slip. On the other hand, I don't think the 2010 summit is necessarily the time to start thinking about the next set of goals, because if you do that, people will feel they're let off the hook for the ones that we've got. So I think we need to come out of 2010 summit with a clear action plan to achieve what we can for the next 5 years, but for sure start thinking about the issues you've raised. I mean, there are some areas where certainly a new set of goals could be vastly beefed up. That's one. Really, climate, environment, energy, they don't get a lot of focus in the goals, and yet we can now see just how integral this is going to be to development progress. The goals, while they were launched in 2000, the work was done in the 1990s. Well, that's quite a long time ago now. So you have to constantly be, renewing and innovating in your paradigm and your approach.
Kevin.
Kevin Hobgood-Brown from Sino Gold. You mentioned the macro impact that the private sector has in terms of improving economic conditions across the board, but could you highlight for us some of the areas in which the private sector is effectively supporting UNDP programs nationally or internationally?
Well, there's two levels, I think. There's the level of the corporate social responsibility, where many companies with a global reach are active in particular communities in which they're operating in a social responsibility sense. And that's always fantastic for those communities. But what UNDP set out to do a couple of years ago was think bigger than that and look at how a company doing well could be also harnessed to a development goal, and so that the business model would be constructed with that as, you know, one of the desired outputs. And the business call to action was launched, as I said, with Prime Minister Gordon Brown, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd's support. Some of the world's biggest companies have signed up to it, with the challenge that they then look at their business model and come back with a plan as to how to build a focus on development into it. I guess, you know, we can easily think of examples of business investment which can be incredibly helpful to development. For example, investment in cell phone technology. What a revolution that is bringing in so many parts of the developing world as an enabler. Very profitable for the companies doing the investment, but opening up incredible opportunities as well. I'll give you just, you know, one example of how that kind of investment then relates to other things you can do. UNDP in Ethiopia put up the seed funding to develop the concept for an Ethiopian commodities exchange, which Ethiopia had never had. The traditional way of selling your coffee or your seeds or grain was the middleman came round to your village, it took your crop, and really you had no idea what the global market price was. You don't know whether you're being ripped off or not. Probably were in many cases. So the idea was to have a commodities exchange which would have more transparent trading and be linked into what the global price is. I went to the exchange and rang the bell, as one would in the Sydney Stock Exchange, and the traders were on the floor like you'd see in Chicago or London or Wall Street or wherever. And up on the boards, the international price for that grade of coffee or whatever it was at the time. With the cell phone technology, that news can be right back to the village and the small farmer. And it links them into global markets. So a whole lot of things start to connect here. And I found that very, very, very exciting, both the concept of the exchange and the concept of the feedback through new technologies to farmers. I think it's revolutionary.
Michael.
Fully Love from the Lowy Institute. Thank you, Ms. Clark, for the very substantive and interesting remarks you made. I wonder, as we in Sydney don't hear from senior UN officials too often, can I ask you just a slightly broader question? Can I ask you to reflect on the similarities and the differences that you've personally experienced going from being a national political leader to the head of an international agency and a senior international official? And I wonder if to any extent it's changed your thinking on public policy and what changes things in the world.
You would be surprised how similar the two jobs are. Very political, of course. The context is highly political, and it draws on all the same skills sets. But there's one major difference. When you are the leader of a developed country, you have in your institutions tremendous capacity. So as a government, you can formulate a strategy, you can formulate your policies, you formulate your actions, and you know you have the capacity to deliver them. In a sense, that's what development is about. In the realm in which I'm working now, capacity or lack of it is the big issue. And we can work to support good strategies, we can work to support good policies and share experience about what works, but critically we have to work to grow capacity, because otherwise the strategies and the policies stay as exactly that without the action following through. So that's the substantial difference that I've observed, and makes me very committed to trying to support that software side of development, which is the capacity to actually deliver on what are good plans on paper.
Whit Mason is my name. I actually want to ask a question that's very much a follow-up on Michael's. I worked with UNDP in Afghanistan, in Kandahar, and was asked what I thought of the idea of extending a program that had been deployed in the north, which was called Access to Justice at the District Level, down in the south of Afghanistan. And what this program does is basically encourage people to demand recognition of a higher standard of human rights than they might be inclined to otherwise. So I asked a number of Afghans in Kandahar what they thought of this, and they said, well, Whit, first of all, you understand that nobody could go out to work in the district, so you'd be asking people to come from the districts into Kandahar city. And then you'd be encouraging them to go back and tell the villagers that they lead and they work with that they should be demanding a higher, recognition of human rights. But these areas are all under Taliban either control or strong influence, and they can't ask for the degree of recognition even that they think they're entitled to already. So I convey this back to UNDP in Kabul, and I thought it was a done deal and that they would give that up and wait for another day when the security situation was more conducive. So I was very surprised about a month later when the Canadians said, hey, we've just gotten a proposal and we need to comment on it to Ottawa right away. UNDP is asking for $3 million to launch this program. What do you think? And I said, well, I've got to tell you what I already told them, and so I passed that on. About a week later, I was told by Kabul that I had stabbed them in the back by driving away $3 million, which otherwise would have, been used to buy cars and so forth. And my question is really just what you think this says about or indicates about the organizational culture or some structural issues in UNDP itself, and what can be done about that. Thanks.
Well, personally, I think your advice should have been listened to, because delivering a program like that in a war zone has clearly got limited efficacy and reach. Secondly, what it might say is that sometimes resource mobilisation comes ahead of practicality. It sounds a little bit like the lure of the $3 million was driving it, rather than whether the program could actually be realised. Personally, I would share your assessment that it probably wasn't exactly the area to focus on in that area at that particular time.
Giovanna Arrarte from Gap Migration. I just want to pick up on this business call to action and the participation of the private sector, employment and also education. I wonder whether there is currently a program that allows corporations to work together with the governments in establishing training institutions under which the citizens of developing countries could actually further their skills and subsequently provide the corporation that have assisted that particular citizen with the ability to work for the corporation in any location or branch in the world. Thank you.
I'm not personally aware of that, and I guess it's probably more in the ILO field of endeavour, but I would make the observation that in my own country, and I'm sure the case is the same here and in many developed countries, that the private sector is incredibly important in training. I mean, take, for example, apprenticeship or skills training. How's it done? Out on the job, in the company. Skilled people teaching others, generally within a framework of national qualifications, which lead to whatever it is, a diploma, a certificate, a trade qualification, whatever. And personally, I think this is a very practical way of delivering skills training. Needs to be linked to those who do the theoretical side of it, as it generally is. Could be technical institutes, TAFEs. I don't know what the appropriate parallel here would be, or many of the private sector training providers are quite sophisticated on that side as well. So I think if we're thinking then of how can we apply some of those insights in developing countries, and looking at the goodwill of a number of the major companies to be participating in the business call to action. Indeed, one of the key focuses really should be training, and then people having had the opportunity to train, maybe is there some horizontal mobility available in the company. I think you raise a really useful point.
Okay, one very last question at the back.
Clive McConaughey, President of the Global Peace Index and Director of the Institute for Economics and Peace. Just dealing with almost the last two questions, we deal with the nexus of peace, business and development, or economics. And I'm just wondering if you could comment on the extent to which the UNDP can influence governments with which they're involved in, given the political nature of the relationship, in policy initiatives which will lead to less violence within those countries. Thank you.
Well, it's very timely to raise that question because the UNDP Department, or Bureau of Crisis Prevention and Recovery, is currently working with Norway on a conference which will be held in April on armed violence, citizen insecurity, the problem of armed violence, which costs many more lives on a daily basis, weekly basis, than what we recognise as armed conflict in a conflict zone. And the Norwegians are rather interested in taking the lead as a country in seeing whether we might be able to mobilise global attention, activity, interest in some kind of convention around this, sort of move the boundaries of international law on this area. So I am intending to go to the conference myself. The Prime Minister of Norway will be involved, and Norway, as you know, is a country that's made a tremendous contribution to peace building in many ways. So watch the space. It's on in Oslo in April to start sort of teasing out how this might happen. I'm aware that in a number of countries these kinds of pressures of armed violence are really increasing greatly. It's a huge concern in Central America and the Caribbean as we speak. For example, as some of the spillover effects of organised crime and the drug trade get squeezed out of other countries and through there and across to parts of West Africa as well. So it is a big issue.
Okay, well, Ms. Clark, thank you so much for coming and speaking with us today. You've only been in this job for less than a year, and it's already obvious that you've got a real focus on the MDGs and making them effective and achieving them to the extent that we can. So thank you for your perspectives today. The Lowy Institute is very interested in development issues. In fact, we're planning a major conference on the MDGs, to which we hope you'll come in May, supported by AusAid and the Australian Government. So we would like to continue to engage with you and with yourself and UNDP in this area. Can I just say it's terrific that we've got a leader from this particular region heading this agency, and I hope that will lead to a much greater Asia-Pacific perspective on development issues in the years ahead. So thank you for coming and talking with us today, and we wish you all the very best for the future. Thank you.